Hello everyone, and welcome into the Lore Council. This is Cade, and today I will be debunking the worst arguments, in my opinion, against the expanded universe. And first up on the chopping block we have, George Lucas never considered it his canon. His canon was only the movies. So then if you're using this as your argument, I hope you also love the Ewok movies, as well as the holiday special. After all, George Lucas did make those, right? And yeah, he might have said later that he didn't like the holiday special. And of course, no one takes that seriously because obviously the holiday special in the Ewoks movie, well, one is bad, being the holiday special, and the other one is a made-for-TV movie that is exclusively for children. And to be honest, we can go back and we can find quotes of George saying in Splinter of the Mind's Eye that, his story is the movies and whatever, and that the future of Star Wars would be told along with comics and novels and stuff by comic book writers and novelists and stuff like that, as well as his involvement in things like Shadows of the Empire. He had input on the Thrawn trilogy, he had input on the New Jedi Order, he had input on what could and could not happen in Star Wars before the prequels had happened. He had input on The Force Unleashed, he had input and told Genndy Tartakovsky what he wanted for the original 2003 Clone Wars animated series. So yeah, he's been involved. And even going past Lucas, obviously Lucasfilm, his company, regarded the expanded universe as canon. And yes, you can find quotes of employees and everything saying that as well. So at what point do we just grow up and just acknowledge that yes, George Lucas made this, and yes, the original 6 movies, well, half of them are great, and the other half are just there. And of course, that's just my opinion. I'm not a huge prequel fan. So in order to avoid that little flame war that would undoubtedly happen if I continue down that line of thinking, let's just conclude this point with, it doesn't really matter what George Lucas thinks, because he's going to say whatever his crazy old man medicine is going to tell him to say that day, because he's flip-flopped on this point several times throughout his life. So let's just go ahead on to point number 2. And that is, the expanded universe was all bad. And this is a very, very stupid point because I don't know anybody in my personal life, or even just in online circles, that has read every single expanded universe novel, comic, short story, played every single video game and done every single ending through it and 100%ed everything. That would be the only time that I would ever trust someone to say it's all garbage. Why? Because one of my biggest things is you cannot properly judge a piece of media unless you have experienced that, whether it's watching it, reading it, etc. That's why I would never comment on a lot of the new canon stuff that has come out and said, this is trash, this is bad. Yeah, I might do it in a joking manner and in a context that is clearly a joke, which is totally fine in my opinion. Everybody needs some stones thrown at them once in a while. But to go out there and say that all the expanded universe was bad when all you've done is watched a Hello Greedo video on the worst things from the expanded universe, that's just a very ill-informed statement in the first place. And yes, a lot of what you're going to like in the expanded universe is going to be very subjective. I'm a big fan of pretty much everything, but post-Return of the Jedi is my favorite. I also really like the Old Republic era, and some stuff in the prequels and Clone Wars era as well. It's all a nice, big, happy continuity. And yes, there are some amazing stories, but there are also some absolutely dog water stories. In no running continuity like the expanded universe are you going to have all hits. Look at your favorite superhero. Are all of their comics bangers? No, there are going to be amazing comics that are held up to the highest regard, and there are going to be bad comics that are rightfully ridiculed for being bad. So even if you are well read enough, even if you have experienced wide swaths of the expanded universe, for you to still hold up your singular opinion of you didn't like any of it and you thought it was bad to it's all bad is very subjective, which is the case for most anti-expanded universe arguments. So with that, I will leave this point with saying, read some of it and I guarantee your opinion will change. Next up is that the expanded universe was rife with contradictions and messed up plot points. And I would say, yeah, there are some continuity issues, and some of them did have to be fixed with retcons. And I think, again, that's totally fine. What long-running comic series has never had some form of retcon? I know Spider-Man has, the Incredible Hulk has, Captain America has, the Avengers have, Iron Man, the Punisher, Daredevil. All these popular characters have had elements of their story retconned, and that is totally fine. That is just something that is going to happen. And yes, some of it was because of mandates of George Lucas, such as in the Thrawn trilogy, they mention the Clone Wars being about fighting mad clones. That's what Captain Pelion remembers. And then we find out that the clones were actually the good guys. Well, that's because everybody from that time period thought that the clones in the Clone Wars would be the bad guy. It is in the name. Usually, the name of the war, if your name is in it, you probably are not the good guy. If the conflict is named after a side that fought in it, a lot of times it is not going to be where those are the good guys. Yeah, if it's, the Allies versus the Axis powers, then yeah, one of those is going to be the good guy. But if it was just the Axis powers wars, you could probably guess that the Axis would be the bad guys. Just like how everyone assumed that when Luke and Obi-Wan are talking about the Clone Wars, that the clones would be the bad guys. And, that's a totally different plot point. But, stuff like that. And people will say, haha, look at this. These guys didn't even know what the Clone Wars were. They were also writing it a decade before the Clone Wars came out. Another big point of contention is Boba Fett. Because in one short story or novel, I can't remember, but they say his name was Jaster Muriel, and he was an ex-stormtrooper who defected from the Empire and went on it his own way. Well, then they end up retconning it in Attack of the Clones, Lucas did that is, that Boba Fett was actually a clone of Jango Fett. And then they had to kind of just retcon it where Jaster Muriel ended up being just an alias that Boba Fett used. Again, nothing big. And the cool part about Boba Fett was the mystery. Nobody knew who he was. And of course, later in the expanded universe, it just becomes common knowledge that he's a clone and everything. But up until that point, it's a perfectly good reason to where everything can all still exist within one continuity. Where things did start getting murky was with the introduction of 2008's The Clone Wars series, where Dave Filoni was given his own spot in the Star Wars hierarchy of canon, and basically allowed to more or less pick and choose what would continue to be canon, but it didn't really work that way considering there was all this long-running stuff, and him putting characters in who were already dead or who were supposed to survive past the Clone Wars created issues, some of which were not able to be resolved. Cough, cough, Evan Peele's death. And yeah, Dave Filoni ended up creating more contradictions in the short amount of time that his show existed than had ever been created. Up to that point anyways. And the final point on our stop here would be the expanded universe was actually all just licensed fan fiction. And I suppose, yeah, in a certain kind of way, you could argue it is, I guess. Then I hope you would keep that same energy if you start talking about the Clone Wars TV show that everyone loves so much, about Rebels, which has a fairly good amount of fans, and about anything that has come out in Star Wars that you like that is not by George Lucas. Because that is, again, to kind of tie it back to the George Lucas argument, the whole point of people who bring this kind of stuff up, where George Lucas's word is law. If he didn't write it, it doesn't matter. Well, he didn't write anything for the Clone Wars TV show, and people love that. A lot of people really like Rebels. He didn't write a thing for that. People really love The Mandalorian, and guess what? George Lucas didn't write anything about that. So to say that anything that George Lucas didn't write is just licensed fan fiction is technically, in a way, true from a certain point of view. See what I did there? It's funny, because it's a Star Wars joke. What you're actually doing is completely disregarding the hours and hours and days that people have put into creating these things. You are just disregarding the effort that all the novelists put into writing the expanded universe novels, the comic book writers and artists that spent tons of their time writing and drawing and coloring these comic books, as well as everyone's favorite thing, video games. How many hours of manpower do you think it took to make Battlefront 2 in 2005? To say that this is just fan fiction just completely disregards that, and I in general think is a very stupid argument because, like a lot of the other arguments, you can apply it to something like Marvel or DC Comics. How come one creator's thing matters more than another's? You know, would you say that any Spider-Man story that isn't by Stan Lee would be licensed fan fiction? No, it's just the same story, same universe, different writer, different author, different artist, etc. And I think that's one of the most important things about the expanded universe is you have this plethora of writing as well as art styles. And I think it works great. And was a big part of what made the expanded universe so fun to read. And with that, this has been Cade from the Lore Council. If you've enjoyed this video, drop it a like. And if you're a fan of the expanded universe, tell me down below what is your least favorite argument that people try and use to delegitimize the expanded universe. And if you're not a fan of the EU or Legends, tell me why you're not, and if you think any of these have influenced you to not read it. And if you have been enjoying this video and would like to see other content similar to this, on other franchises perhaps, drop the Lore Council a subscription. We are trying to grow the channel and every little bit helps. And until next time, this has been Cade from the Lore Council, signing off.